Welcome to the Manhattan Project. This is day 21.
Some people say 20. Tonight we saw the movie Gook,
which is a word that maybe we shouldn't be saying as white people. But at the same time, one of the themes in this movie are the fact that words like this are not necessarily inherently offensive when you take them in a different context. It all depends on the history and how the word is being used, right? But at the same time, we're going to censor those words so that you don't cut them out of context and make us look bad.
This is the internet, after all. So yeah, tonight we went to go see Gook. Take a look at that journey.
Back at Regal Union. You guys already know the drill. We're here like every single day ever. So Gook stars and is written and directed by Chon. He plays a young Korean American in Los Angeles during the Rodney King riots. It's sort of about the perspective in the life of him and the people that surround him, the tension between the black community and the Asian community, as well as, of course, the police and the white community, all in the context of one very dramatic day. Take a look at the trailer. So Evan, what were your expectations going into this film?
My expectations were decently high. I knew that it had been at Sundance. I knew that some people were comparing it to Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, but just from a different perspective. I recently learned about the history of Korean Americans in LA during the riots, that a lot of those business owners were affected by the riots. So I assumed it would be both an informational time and also like a nice indie film look.
Here's my take. It's a really compelling piece of cinema that is thankfully able to showcase a really underdeveloped voice in Hollywood, but unfortunately starts to fall apart a little at the end thanks to its overindulgence in melodrama. Agree or disagree?
I agree. I think that the strengths of this movie are immediately obvious. I think that part of the potential flaws of the movie have to do with the particular sub-genre it's in. And on the one hand, you feel like the creators could have very easily made a couple changes that would make it stand out. On the other hand, they want to commit to certain ideas that require them to stick with it. So before we get into a little bit of the issues, just the strengths, I think we can both agree that this movie did a really good job at being like real, if that makes sense. Like that descriptor, I feel like is a good way to describe a lot of stuff in this movie. There's a lot of arguments, and they're not necessarily these clean-cut things. It's the way people talk in real life where they argue and talk over each other, and I felt like they were always coming from the place of the characters. They're hotheads and stuff, and you get to know them and you can tell when they're going to argue.
It's really easy to mess up the dialogue and the performances in something like this, something that's so emotion heavy and talkative and aping a style that has been developed by people like Spike Lee. And yet the dialogue really never falters in this film. It benefits from the fact that, like you said, not only does it feel real, it's got some of that Soderbergh-esque, mumblecore-esque sort of like improv feel to it, even if it wasn't improv, with people talking over each other, or talking in circles. But it also benefits from having a lot of silences. There's a large amount of tension breaks that are kind of awkward purposefully, I think, and effectively, in my opinion, during particularly scenes of conflict, or scenes of fear, scenes of anger, scenes of concern, or whatever. You have characters look at each other, and you have a dramatic pause or a pregnant pause, and it doesn't necessarily feel like we're pushing in on something or it was orchestrated or rehearsed to be exactly like that. It just felt like the reality of the moment where people are trying to gather their thoughts and argue. And yeah, that's perhaps the biggest strength of this movie, is shit just feels authentic through and through. Also, really good characters. Another thing that would be really easy to at least take for granted when writing a movie like this, because you put in your cliche elements. Yes, you have sort of these hip, young Korean characters who are super Americanized, use tons of ebonics and slang and shit like that. They have aspirations of making it big. One of them wants to be an artist, one of them wants to be an R&B artist and stuff like that. Like all these things that you could just take for granted as like being annoying characters, or character traits that we've seen in tons of these like urban movies that deal with a marginalized part of society in their natural habitat or whatever, which is, in this case, it would be Koreans in LA. And yet, again, you like all the characters. You're not really annoyed by any of them. You feel the concerns of them. Whenever people act irrational or angry or selfish, you buy the fact that they're in a situation that, thanks to what you know about them specifically as people, and also just what you know about the context of the time in LA and just the craziness with the riots, you get how fear could really just be the biggest motivator for all these behaviors. And that's just great. It's so rare you see a movie where you have a lot of characters doing a lot of potentially shitty things or noble good things, depending on what the scene is, and yet you understand and you don't necessarily judge throughout. That's great.
Yeah, to give a little bit more context, there's two brothers who are running their father's shoe store. It was a women's shoe store. The one guy wants to be an R&B singer. The other guy wants to sell like a different kind of shoes, like sneakers and stuff, but he hasn't quite made that transition yet. And they both are under a lot of stress because the store isn't doing very well. There's also a lot of racial tensions. People in the neighborhood don't particularly like them. So as a result, you have both brothers at different points in the movie acting selfishly, acting in a way that is not taking into stock, sort of the greater good or whatever else. But you never hate them for making that decision. Like John says, a lot of empathy, a lot of just like easy understanding why people went through that decision. It helps that these are not non-actors, but not recognizable actors. I don't have to be distracted by like watching the three, Asian actors that most Americans know. They didn't have to cast John Cho to get this movie funded. This movie was so cheap they could cast just really good normal actors, and then they disappear to the roles, and you totally buy it and don't think that you're watching an actor.
And at the same time, this dude Justin
Chon,
who directed and wrote it, he holds up as the actor. Sometimes you get writer-directors who put themselves in the lead and they can't quite handle it. But in here, I think it really benefits because the movie is so anchored by his performance, because the movie is potentially improvised. It sort of feels that way. Him steering this whole ship as writer-director, he fits really well having your main character be the person that would be the most in tune with the director's thoughts, because it is the director. So that was another great thing. It's like he gives a performance. And then also finally, this is just we've had a long run of movies lately that have really good performances from children. You have a very young child here. I don't know the name of the actress. I've never seen her before. I'm sure she's been in nothing. But you have this like, how old is she? Like 10 or something
10,
like that?
Something like that, 9 or 10. Just
10-year-old little girl
really,
who's just like throughout this entire movie, she's got tons of scenes, prolonged scenes. She's got moments where she has to react with emotion without speaking, moments where she has to have long bits of dialogue. And you buy it almost all the time. Like, she's not the best performer in the movie, but she's certainly a notch above your average actor. And I have to imagine that a lot of the authenticity of that performance was taken from the direction. It was taken from, perhaps she is a non-actor, maybe she's from LA. Maybe they were clearly able to come through to her and find the chemistry with her friendship between the main dude and her is very palpable. It feels very real. Like they were able to develop it on set. Truthfully. Also, just as far as the writing for her character goes, so often they make kids either just really, really annoying or like way too cute and precocious and too nice, and they finally get a good balance of like a kid who's like, yes, sometimes she's annoying, sometimes she's precocious, sometimes she's a lot of things that you've seen before, but you always, once again, get the context of it. It feels like it just makes a lot of sense. There was one scene with the girl and with the brothers, which maybe we can use this as a transition to a few things we don't like. It's kind of in the middle of the movie. There's like a dance sequence scene that to me felt like sort of a pandering attempt to like be a memorable, crowd-pleasing moment in what had been a fairly natural 16. Maybe you disagree. No, I don't. I was saying it's also probably the most expensive moment by far. They use a Hall & Oates song.
Yeah,
it's out of nowhere. You're like, wow, this movie's... There's recognizable music throughout this movie, but nothing like that.
Maybe that song came in after Sundance and it was a different song before. Who knows? But as the movie goes on, basically in the third act, it gets into a more predictable gear because there's riots going on. So we know that there's like a physical threat towards the store, that the brothers have to make some decisions, that there's other characters getting angry involved. You know that it's going to sort of spill over, and it does so, like John said, in a very melodramatic way. Especially because it has like kind of like fake out endings too, which just like add to the trouble. Like if it had just ended at certain moments, it would have been more agreeable to me.
Yeah, there's just this thing where they'd set up the dynamics between the characters and what had happened throughout that day and the conflict so well. They were going to reach a boiling point, and they kind of do reach a boiling point with regards to conversation and fight. But then after that water spills over, you just have another 15 minutes of like violence and like actual climactic action that just, is not necessary and does not fit the rest of the realism of the tone. I'm not saying the shit that happens at the end doesn't feel real. It is very grounded, but it's a bit much, right? You know, it almost becomes good time for a second with Robert Pattinson, where it's like, well, are you just like is the point here to just show how dark shit can get? And then some of the acting starts to fall apart there too, especially you have some of these players that haven't been in the movie as much start to play a bigger role, and they have to take on some really heavy shit to do. I'm not going to spoil any of it, but that's again to me where I was really tuned into the emotion of this film, and yet it's starting to lose me. There's also just some weird decisions from a direction standpoint there. You have shit like, you know, this is a movie where characters are talking so real, and then you have like someone who's upset punching themselves. You know what I mean? You have that shit like, it really is like the Good Will Hunting, like it's not your fault type of scene stuff, right, where it's like, really? Like someone didn't read this draft and say, dude, come on, this is middle school level Shakespearean ass melodrama writing and performance and direction. So it was a shame that it got kind of lost at the end for me. I didn't hate the resolution. I didn't hate what it had to say about like the only way you could conclude a story like this. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's completely out of nowhere. And yet I really would have appreciated them resisting and pulling back and going for a more subtle ending.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I put these faults down to the trappings of that subgenre of like Sundance-y, Spike Lee influence, talky thing that like still wants to grab you at the end. I think when it comes to this director and stuff, with another project, would presumably not fall prey to the same things.
Right, but that's not an excuse. It's still a flaw of the movie.
No, I'm just saying, like, still, I'm happy to say for me the takeaway is it's I'm excited about this new voice.
Oh yeah, no doubt, and I agree.
It doesn't excuse the movie, but that's just.
But it's just like, yeah, I really wish it didn't have to end like that, because this shit I was riding a high on this movie. It was one of the better things I'd seen all year, and then when the cards actually all dropped, I was like, okay, this is a good movie. It's a very good movie. I wouldn't say this is a great movie, and it almost was a great movie. But yeah, check it out. In my opinion, it's definitely one to see. Especially, it's definitely a great alternative to what's out there on the market. Not just because it finally serves some, like I said, some very, very underrepresented voices. Like how often do you see a movie about Koreans and Korean Americans, released in America? But also just like, yeah, it's a damn good movie. Check this shit out. Flaws aside, there's way more good than there is bad. That's my recommendation.
So my simile for this movie would be, it's like going on a bike tour where the first 2/3 you're seeing all this territory you never thought you'd see, and then the last bit you suddenly are just like
you
riding.
Hit a rock.
You hit a rock.
Like, I'm still on, but I don't feel good. Like,
yeah, it turns to gravel. You go from like a nice paved trail to gravel, and like you're still getting where you're going, but it's a little bumpy.
Something like a 3 out of 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Thanks so much for watching, guys.
We're the Manhattan Project. We put up a new review every single day, which means that we're going to be back tomorrow.
The next day.
And the next day.
And the next day.
And the next day.
So stay tuned for more reviews of indie movies, big movies, and everything in between. Death Note.
One of these days, we'll get the budget for a Hall & Note song in the episode.